Good morning. It's 3 minutes after 10 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, for which I thank you. I'm tempted to talk about trains today. I know that sounds a little bit North Norfolk digital, but there's one extraordinary piece in one newspaper essentially describing 1,000 trains a day being cancelled, crumbling infrastructure, ageing carriages, data showing that in the 12 weeks from the 12th of November to the beginning of last month, an average of 1,062 trains a day were cancelled across England and Wales. I'm just giving you a heads up on something that might pop up a little later in the programme, because I find myself in the very odd position. I travel by train quite a lot, but it has changed for me. I only noticed this morning, because I'm due to travel by train tonight, this evening. I won't tell you where I'm going, because I would be inundated by autograph hunters if I did, and it would add to the burdens of the guard to have to exercise some form of crowd control. But I don't think I travel by train in the same way that I did even 5 years ago, let alone 30 years ago. You'd tell your dad what time your train was getting in the days before mobile phones, and your dad would be there to pick you up at the station, right? That's how it would work. I can't do that tonight. I cannot say to whoever might pick me up at whatever station it is to which I'm going, I can't say I'll see you at 8:30 or I'll see you at 6:30. Because I having travelled by train a lot this year and last year, I know that the likelihood of getting there at the time advertised on the timetable is, well, slim, or considerably slimmer than it ever was. I think we might have a look at that, but I need to find a slightly more exciting way of dressing it up for you. We're going to begin with Theresa May. Wait a second and I'll tell you why. We're going to begin with Theresa May because when a former Prime Minister leaves Parliament, it is a moment of historical importance, even if we are living through a period where we've had so many Prime Ministers that it is genuinely hard to keep count. It's very, well, I wish it was easier to forget Liz Truss, but it is quite easy to forget Liz Truss. When you're going through in your head, what have we had? Have we had 5? Because you include David Cameron. Cameron was there in 2016, so you include Cameron. Who followed Cameron and then May then Johnson and then Sunak. Oh no, Truss. So yes, it is. There's 5 MPs in 8 years. 5 PMs, forgive me, in 8 years. Absolutely extraordinary to reflect upon what that tells us about the state of the party. And of course, because they're the party of government, it's what it tells us about the state of the country. Chaotic doesn't even come close, does it? And yet still in some polls, the Tories are hitting 20%. So I also, I mean, you know this by now, I suffer from what could be loosely described as the curse of the centrist dad. And by that I mean that my impulses are always to be nice, always to be kind, and always to be compassionate. I try to see the best in people, even when it leaves me humiliated and embarrassed. In the cases, for example, of Matt Hancock, who I had warm words to say during some elements of lockdown. How wrong can a man be about a politician? Answer, listen to some of my comments about Matt Hancock back in the day. And he's not the only one. This strain, this psychic strain that I feel whenever we discuss public figures, to just try to be nice. I always suffer for this. Is why I don't go to events. Have I ever told you this? I didn't even go to the Kebab Awards this year. And the Kebab Awards has always been one of my favourite dates in the calendar. But the organisers always sit me next to, on top table, a senior Tory. And it means that the next time that senior Tory is in the news for, I don't know, expecting you to pick up the bill for their libel of an academic, then I feel my guns are spiked. I sat next to James Cleverly once on the One Show sofa, and it meant that the next time James Cleverly was in the news for doing something dodge, I kind of felt a personal... I don't have that ability that some people in my line of work have to forget the personal when you wade in on the political. So I always feel that my coverage of politics is polluted somewhat by personality. I think, well, you might be listening. Oh, I don't have it with everyone. I don't have it with Boris Johnson, although I did for a while. I certainly don't have it with Liz Truss, but I've got it in spades with Theresa May, and I don't understand why. I even tweeted this morning in an attempt to gird my own loins, to resist the Theresa-abilitation that I knew would be sweeping the airwaves by 10 o'clock this morning. Everybody everywhere saying, oh, well, you know, she wasn't that bad. Oh, she's not as bad as Boris Johnson. Nobody is as bad as Boris Johnson. There's a line in the film The Holdovers, which I have to tell you is quite beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful film. I only saw it last night. But I'm going to give you a quick trigger warning here, and I'm not making light of anyone who suffers from this condition. But at the end of it, and I don't want to give you any spoilers, but at the end of it, the sort of anti-hero says to his nemesis, he delivers one of the finest insults I've ever heard in my life. But I'm giving you a trigger warning. He says, "You are penis cancer in human form." And I did find myself thinking just a moment ago, you can't say Theresa May's all right. She's not as bad as Boris Johnson. It's tempting to say penis cancer's not as bad as Boris Johnson. There is an absolute horror show in place if you start saying people aren't that bad because they're not as bad as Boris Johnson. The moral of that story is, of course, that you really must go and see The Holdovers. Oh, Sarah, please don't remind me that I was even quite nice about Rishi Sunak when he took over. And do you know why I was quite nice about Rishi Sunak when he took over? Do you know why? Because he wouldn't be as bad as Boris Johnson. Liz Truss, I don't think I had anything warm to say about Liz Truss. But if I did, it would be because he wasn't as bad as Boris Johnson. So I think we need to be on guard today. I think we need to be on our toes. We need to be on tiptoes, don't we? To guard against excessive Theresa-abilitation. Excessive Theresa-abilitation. But my question for you will be whether or not there is room for some Theresa-abilitation. Whether or not, in fact, comparisons like this are vaguely valid and do deserve a little bit of, I don't know what the word would be, recalibration. Is there? Well, and the way we do that is simple. We make it very, very personal. So I'm pretty confident that Theresa May was an awful Prime Minister. Off the top of my head, I give you the red lines, which were obscene and awful and absurd. The determination to pander to the racists who'd driven Brexit over the line by promising to abolish freedom of movement meant that we had to leave the customs union and the single market, and even the sensible Brexiters had told us, the supposedly sensible Brexiters had told us that the customs union and the single market were categorically not being taken off the table by leaving the European Union. And there we are. You also have Windrush, which to me was and remains a hideously ugly scar on the national record. 11 minutes after 10 is the time. And for the third one, well, I don't know really whether you'd go for making Boris Johnson Foreign Secretary or whether you'd go for the way she treated the police when she was Home Secretary. You could now throw in the go home vans. You could throw in the response to Grenfell. There's all sorts of things you could cite. What would you cite as a positive, except for the fact that she wasn't as bad as Boris Johnson? I'm not going to mention that condition again, but I hope it now resonates and I hope it now throbs in the back of everybody's mind as a phrase that you will think of whenever the words "not as bad as Boris Johnson" is uttered. 12 minutes after 10 is the time. Let's make it personal then. Let's make it personal. I say Theresa May, you say what? And I'm outlawing not as bad as Boris Johnson, or indeed not as bad as Liz Truss, or even not as bad as Rishi Sunak. I'm outlawing that. You can't have that today. That's off the table. But I do want to leave the door ajar for vaguely complimentary or positive contributions to the programme. I know it's hard for younger listeners to believe, but when a former Prime Minister leaves Parliament, it is a matter of moment. It is a significant event. And usually assembling a sort of political epitaph would be de rigueur. It would be completely normal. It feels weird now, doesn't it? Not least because we've seen one former Prime Minister leave the House of Commons since Theresa May was Prime Minister. One of her successors walked the plank. But I am open to the suggestion. I am categorically open to the contention that she wasn't all bad. But I also really want your help today, reminding everybody listening why the Theresa-abilitation, you can tell I'm pleased with having come up with that word, can't you? Because I'm using it so much. Why the Theresa-abilitation, it needs to be at the very least challenged and at the most furiously resisted. Okay, so let's get the phone lines open. Theresa May, what did and does she mean to you? 0345 6060 973. Good God, there's so much I'd forgotten. Don't forget, says Sarah, she was the first to fly to America when Trump was elected and was filmed holding his hand. Again, this is awful. Is it a sort of benign misogyny? Is it because she's a woman and I was raised to be respectful of women in a way that I wasn't raised to be respectful of men? Is it because she's a woman that I find myself feeling, I call it benign misogyny, benign sexism, sort of protective? So I want to say no one forced her to hold on. If Donald Trump came to hold your hand and pulling it away would cause a diplomatic incident, would you not leave your hand in Donald Trump's orange paw? I don't know, but again, you say that, you cite that as an example of reasons not to like her, and I start feeling sorry if that's what we're doing today. We got there in the end. We got there quite early, actually, by my standards. Remind me why I should not be feeling sorry for Theresa May today. 03456. It's the cough. It's the blooming cough. Do you remember the cough? Even before the letters started falling off the backdrop, that's when you thought that you were witnessing some sort of supreme meta parody, and that they were going to it would be like on Saturday Night Takeaway when the celebrity doesn't know he's about to appear on. I don't know how they do that, by the way. It was Chesney Hawkes on that last week's or the week's, but how on earth does Chesney Hawkes end up in what he thinks is a safety deposit box room without realising that he's been brought in backstage at a massive TV studio or theatre, so that when the walls of the safety deposit box fall down, he's on stage with Ant and Dec in a massive TV studio or theatre? I honestly don't know, but when the letters started falling off the wall behind Theresa May, that's when you honestly thought that you were witnessing some sort of politics meets performance art moment, and it must be deliberate. It can't have gone this badly without it being planned in advance. Was that the same one, the P45 one? So the letters fell off the wall, she couldn't stop coughing, and then a comedian jumped on stage and tried to give her a P45, all in one conference speech. You'd have to be made of butter not to feel sorry for her at that point. And she came on dancing, and you sort of think of your mum's friend, don't you? She came on doing the Abbot thing. You thought, oh, bless you. And then you remember the go-home vans and the hostel. It was Michael No, it wasn't. It was, I don't know. Was it Michael McIntyre? Not Anson. Oh, God. I'm so confused. Remind me why I shouldn't be. Michael McIntyre, not Anson Dec. I'm sorry. The star of the show or something. I don't know. It all blurs into one when you're my age. I'll be talking about the generation game next. Remind me why we should not feel sorry for Theresa May. And remind me why her legacy should actually be pungent as opposed to polite. Because the benefit of being followed by the worst three Conservative prime ministers, the worst three prime ministers in living memory, Johnson, Truss, Sunak, should not be allowed to overshadow the fact that, with the possible exception of David Cameron, she would have been the worst Prime Minister in living memory. So what is it for you? She triggered Article 50, says Owen in Liverpool. She did. This is going to be a long hour. What have I forgotten? What are you going to put on the list? And do it in person. Ring in as well. 0345 6060 973. When I say to you that I can feel myself, oh, God, I can feel forming inside me like a kind of succubus or an alien. I feel like Sigourney Weaver. There's an alien inside me that is feeling sorry for Theresa May and thinking things like, well, she wasn't as bad as Boris Johnson. Please, cure me. Cure me. That's today's challenge. Remind me why we shouldn't be feeling for Theresa May. But because I'm such a balanced and nice person, I have to now add in parentheses, you can ring in with positives. 0345 6060 973. 20 minutes after 10 is the time. Oscar says, I really need this today, James. May is the only one I ever feel sorry for after that conference speech, the way that Boris Johnson was with her too, and the little cry at the end when she resigned. She reminds me of one of my grandma's friends. And then I remember the other stuff like the go-home vans. Today, this programme is dedicated to resisting the Theresa-bilitation that is sweeping the rest of the nation. Mark's in Mill Hill. Mark, help me out.
I'm not going to.
What?
No, it's... Firstly, I'm not going to put you out of your misery because you have teenage daughters and you have to live through all of that. And my first point about Theresa May was, and this is the minor one, sending Amber Rudd in to 2018 general election.
What did she do? Remind me why this. I mean,
this is when it was a TV debate. I think it was ITV, and she wouldn't go up against Corbyn herself. She sent Amber Rudd in to do it for her.
It's not. I mean, in a great charge sheet of things she did wrong. I'm surprised you put that one at the top.
That's just my entry.
Yeah.
My actual lead item is she's the leader of the first government to be found in contempt of Parliament in 2018.
What was that for? What was that?
That was not publishing the government's legal advice.
This is huge.
Geoffrey Cox regarding.
And are you sure
Brexit.
that was the very first time that the government was found to be in contempt of Parliament?
Absolutely. December the 4th, 2018.
Do you know, Brexit's boiled all our brains, hasn't it, mate? Because, you know, the idea that she couldn't publish the actual legal advice that they'd received, because to do so would have alienated her own party, I presume that's the reason, led her to go down the path of contempt instead. This was Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General. Yeah, looking like the Cheshire Cat that he always does on the front bench. And then Keir Starmer asking... no, it's on the list, mate. It's going to be a long list, and you've kicked things off. 23 after 10 is the time. Alex is in Manchester. Alex, what have you got?
Hi, I'm kind of in a similar position to you, James. Well, maybe.
But you mean you're cursed with excessive niceness, Alex?
A little.
Yeah.
She obviously did some bad stuff. There's Windrush as a prime example, and kind of where we ended up with Brexit. And where we ended up with Brexit is a classic example of it's really hard with Theresa May to pinpoint what she stood for. Where was her conviction? Because she was trying to please everybody with Brexit. And in a way, I think she was trying to find a solution that worked for the country because it was ever so close. And she had Remain in her heart, but she was trying to please, make sure it worked for the Brexiteers.
You
and we
are
ended
a
up
bit
at an
like
impasse.
me, because what you're saying is she had an impossible task. She knew that her job was to limit the damage that Brexit would do. She knew that she couldn't say that out loud because all of the headbangers like Rees-Mogg and Francois would have a fit of the vapours, and the opportunist in chief, Boris Johnson, was waiting in the wings to start flogging snake oil on an industrial scale. So she did do that job with a sense of duty, is what you're reminding us of.
You can tell when she left, she said, it's the country that she loved, and she choked up, and, she was trying to do the best, but we reached an impasse because she didn't have the conviction. It's like the robot dancing. You either throw yourself into the dancing or you don't, and it ends up being awkward when you can't quite get it right.
I mean, some people can't throw themselves into the dancing, even if they'd want to, and they're just not possessed of that level of looseness, that level of disassociation.
She's very on the detail, isn't she? She was the one who halted the nuclear deal with China, which Cameron and Osborne had lined up to all go ahead. It was her that looked and wanted to scrutinise that because of security issues. So she was always trying to do the right thing, and
And then people are shouting "Go home" vans, hostile environment, citizens of nowhere. So any good that she did will, for many of us, and even if you leave Brexit out of it, because she deserves a much more nuanced analysis than any of the others since on that one issue, for the reasons that you've articulated perfectly. So if you leave Brexit out of it, anything you cite as a positive is surely going to be undone by the pandering to the forces that have now taken over the Tory party. I think she rolled out a form of red carpet for the likes of 30p Lee and Jonathan Gullis when she started talking about hostile environments and citizens of nowhere and those hideous go-home vans. She made the party nasty again, and I think she was the one that originally said we've got to stop being the nasty party.
Yeah, but it didn't end up being very strong and stable anyway.
Strong and stable, there you go. We should have a sound effect for that. I'd forgotten. Strong and stable. All right, an extra prize, an extra point. Can you remember the Daily Mail front page that greeted her arrival in Downing Street?
Oh, no idea.
Are you ready for this? I've got a memory. I wish I could wash my memory sometimes, Alex. I wish you could get memory bleach. Steel of the New Iron Lady.
Oof.
The steel of the New Iron Lady.
Another legacy. I remember her bringing Liz Truss in. So when she became Prime Minister, I remember Liz Truss coming out of one of the taxis at number 10 and being appointed to the cabinet. So that she also laid the carpet for that.
Put that on the list as well. So I think there is a sort of consensus emerging in that she was nowhere near as objectively awful as what followed. But if we forget about what followed, she'd be awful. And that's quite a tricky thing to negotiate. That's why being a historian is a nuanced and complicated business. Alex, thank you. Thank you also for reminding me of that front page. The steel of the new Iron Lady. Quite extraordinary. And I have to tell you that there is a front page on a national newspaper today, not the same one. There is a front page on a national newspaper today that I think, hand on heart, if you haven't seen it yet, I think it's even more bonkers than the Daily Mail front pages during the Brexit heyday. You remember them? So you've got the steel of the new Iron Lady. Then you've got not even the Brexit, you've got the Liz Truss one. Finally, a true Tory budget. That was just before Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng set fire to our entire economy. You remember the really ugly ones? Crush the Saboteurs. Remember that one? Crush the Saboteurs. Enemies of the People, talking about our independent judiciary. I think there's a front page on a national newspaper today that is, and it's Brexit related, and this, of course, is the home of Brexit Reality. This programme, since 2016, has become synonymous with being proved right about Brexit. I think that today's front page is the most bonkers Brexit front page ever. Just think about that for a minute. All right? I'll tell you what it is after the next news bulletin, actually. But can you believe that I'm sitting here seriously contending that we have the most bonkers Brexit front page ever in front of us? And I'll give you a little clue. It features someone who is likely to be, as things stand, the next leader of the Conservative Party. Ken's in Leeds to steer us back to the resisting the Theresa habilitation. What would you like to say, Ken?
Morning, James.
Hello,
great
Ken.
fun. Yeah, it was a throwaway remark which just encapsulated for me the personality of the woman. A nurse, during one of the open forum events, asked about conditions in the NHS and pay for nurses. And Theresa May's response to that was, there is no such thing as a magic money tree. That just, for me, is illustrated the contempt that woman had.
If memory serves, the nurse hadn't had a pay rise for the best part of a decade, had she?
Exactly so. And it was a careless thing, and I think she thought it was a good answer, and it just highlighted how uncaring that woman was.
Well,
and
particularly
I will never believe anything else.
No, and Home Secretary under David Cameron as well. So the idea that she, the austerity, signing up full-throated for austerity, and then telling a nurse who hadn't had a pay rise for 8 years that there wasn't a sort of magic money tree that we can shake that suddenly provides for everything that people want. You're right. I mean, why do you think? Maybe you suffer from what I suffer from, which I'm going to loosely call a form of benign sexism. Is that I can't almost struggle to go in studs up on a female politician in the way that I would on a male politician. Do you suffer from that at all? Do we need to remind ourselves to be equal?
I'm very conscious of the inequality that we have these days,
yes.
And that women have a real hill to climb.
That's very true.
No, I think it's about personality and ability. When you get to the level of Prime Minister, I think we're past that.
All bets are
and you've got to look at a person's, what their personality and character is. And I'm afraid hers was quite contemptuous.
That's a lovely word, contemptuous, in this context. To say that to a nurse, you could even have been a bit more mealy-mouthed and less offensive. We simply can't afford. But to patronise her by saying there's no magic money tree. If there is no magic money tree, Theresa May, where did Michelle Donnellan get that 15 grand to settle a libel case after she maligned an independent academic in one of the worst ways imaginable? There's a question for the ages. Thank you, Ken. Couple of phone lines free now. Don't text me to complain that you can't get through. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Nazir Afzal, great friend of the programme, former chief prosecutor, of course, up in the northwest. He reminds us that she did agree to criminalise forced marriage, stalking and modern slavery. I saw her listen to victims and act. So there is room here for a little bit of light Theresa-abilitation. But Nazir adds there are many good reasons to attack her, not least her hostile environment. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. I should have done one of those ABCs that you love so much, shouldn't I? I should have made up 2 front pages that are bonkers and included the one that I think is the most bonkers Brexit front page I've ever seen. Considering it's 2024 and the whole world knows that Brexit's a disaster, this assumes almost, I don't know what even the word, this assumes preternatural levels of bonkersness. It's almost admirable in its detachment from reality. Just before we get back onto Theresa May, remember something I told you a while ago about how Liz Truss became leader of the Conservative Party. Liz Truss did something which is still not fully understood by certainly by the client media, but possibly by the broader electorate as well. Liz Truss watched Boris Johnson lying, okay, and she found inspiration. Most people watched Boris Johnson lying and had one of 3 reactions. They, like me and probably you, felt complete disgust, or they felt complete befuddlement at how somebody could get away with this, or they felt a sort of mild guilt at being part of the process but believing it was justified because the end always justifies the means. So that would be Dominic Cummings, for example. So Dominic Cummings, like a lot of Tories who presumably like to see themselves as sensible, Dominic Cummings would have thought, well, Boris Johnson's absolutely awful, but he is the engine that we need. He is the vessel that we need to be aboard in order to achieve our other goals. So those are the 3 reactions to Boris Johnson. Number 1, disgust. Number 2, befuddlement. Number 3, he's awful, but the end justifies the means. Liz Truss watched Boris Johnson, and she felt inspired. She watched Boris Johnson lie about everything. Remember that the deal that he put through, Tom Swarbrick reminded Nick Ferrari of this earlier today, the deal that Boris Johnson finally signed with the European Union contained several elements that he had said when Theresa May was Prime Minister he would be utterly unable to countenance or support. The level of political fraudulence required to do that is beyond most of our ken. And yet Liz Truss watched that and felt inspired. She watched these lies land, and she watched Boris Johnson's popularity grow even as she knew he was lying. And instead of feeling disgust or befuddlement or the end justifies the means, Liz Truss found herself thinking, I wonder whether I can do that. And that's when she started making claims about non-existent trade deals or trade deals that were either equivalent or inferior to what we had before. That's when she started making claims that were designed to appeal exclusively to truth-denying tabloid newspapers and the Conservative Party membership. So Liz Truss's popularity among Conservative Party members started rising in almost direct correlation to the lies she was telling about Brexit. She was the only politician really claiming benefits, claiming victories in what appeared at first glance to be a substantive sense. And her inspiration for that came from watching Boris Johnson lie about everything from the Irish Sea border right through to oven readiness. And what's happening now, which is extraordinary, is that a politician called Kemi Badenoch is watching Liz Truss and her path to power and taking notes. So you would have thought, wouldn't you, in any sensible universe, Liz Truss would be a deterrent. Liz Truss would be a warning sign. Liz Truss would be the poster girl for how not to do politics. But if you are driven entirely by ambition, and integrity is a word you struggle even to spell, then you look at Liz Truss and you think one thing. Well, she got through the door. She got into Downing Street. And if you care more about getting into Downing Street than you do about your constituents, your country, your party, or anything under the sun, you could conceivably watch Liz Truss and think, I'm going to have a bit of that. So just as Liz Truss watched Boris Johnson and his disastrous political trajectory, so Kemi Badenoch watches Liz Truss's even more disastrous political trajectory and feels inspired. And that's how you end up with the most bonkers front page I have ever seen. James O'Brexit has never seen a Brexit front page as bonkers as this. Are you ready for it? Just going to clear my throat before I do this, actually. Excuse me for one moment. Here it is. We got a sound effect? Have you got a trumpet or anything? No? Nothing? Oh, it's all right. I'll do it myself. Here is the most bonkers front page in the... What? In the history of Brexit. Are you ready for this? Yeah, go on. Have a sound effect.
Unhinged headline.
I completely forgot we had an unhinged headline sound effect. Where did that come from? Was that another feature that I came up with and then forgot about the next day, even though we got our own stuff? Can we do that again? Because it sounds great. And now, here it is. Not only the most bonkers Brexit front page of all time, but arguably the most unhinged headline.
Unhinged headline.
I haven't read it out yet, have I? I'm just doing it all for the YouTube viewers. Ready? Brexit is a great British success story worth billions. Brexit has reignited the UK's trade standing in global markets worth hundreds of billions of pounds, says Kemi Badenoch. So there it is. The most bonkers Brexit front page the world has ever seen. And you've actually reminded me now where that unhinged headline idea came from. That was the Daily Telegraph's comment pages, wasn't it? So I'm going to see if I can find... Why did no one remind me, Keith? Why did no one remind me about doing the unhinged headline feature? What was the other one? What other features have we got that we've forgotten to do lately? Woke Watch?
Woke Watch.
Thank you. Unhinged headline. And what was the other one? What's the most recent one? We've done a... Smear kit. These are all brilliant ideas. This is radio. No wonder. Thank you. No wonder we're nominated for the British Broadcasting Guild, Press Guild, something best radio programme in the world, something award nomination. This is genius. This stuff, and you all forget about it. I can't come up with the ideas and implement the ideas and remember the ideas. Someone else has to do the remembering. And today, of course, we are remembering why it would be a mistake. A grave mistake to join the Theresa-abilitation of the former Prime Minister, who has announced this morning that she is quitting Parliament. And again, to give credit where credit's due, she gave the story to the Maidenhead Advertiser. Diana's in Banbury. Diana, I bet you've forgotten why you rang in, but try to remember if you can.
Hi, James.
Hello, Diana.
I do remember. It was about whether or not to feel sorry for Theresa May.
Yes.
I was labelled Yellow Jacket Woman on Question Time in 2017 when I was in the audience. And there was a good deal of, did we feel sorry for Theresa May? And even Emily Thornberry said that she felt sorry for Theresa May. I stuck my hand up. And Fiona Bruce, it was her first show.
Oh, yes.
Said, the woman in the yellow jacket. And
Fantastic.
I said, could we get over feeling sorry for Theresa May?
God, you were ahead of the curve. You were ahead of the curve, weren't you, Diana?
Yeah. She said, hang on, do you never feel sorry for Theresa May? And I said, no, I don't. And I gave a 90-second explanation as to why I didn't. And it went viral on YouTube. It got 3 million views.
Crikey.
It was in every single newspaper, Daily Mail, Evening Standard, Times.
I'm looking at it now.
Financial Times. It was in German, Der Spiegel, and
you were widely hailed as the finest audience contributor in the history of Question Time, Diana.
There we go.
Happy days.
It was quite extraordinary, but because I really felt angry because I'd done a great deal of campaigning to try to prevent Brexit happening, and I could see what was going to happen. I published a piece in the Times 3 weeks before the referendum saying this is going to go the wrong way because I'd talked to so many people in the street all over the place. And Theresa May started this whole slide. I mean, what I said in that 90 seconds was she started the hostile environment,
Yes.
which was not only horrid but failed. She drew all the red lines that made it impossible to negotiate with the EU. She failed to understand that the EU was held together by a body of rules and regulations, and that the way she was approaching it was hopeless. She was the one who had a fixation about what she always called the European Court. It was actually the Human Rights Court.
You're right, yeah. Yes.
Which is not the European Court because she'd messed up trying to get rid of a terrorist, and she'd missed the deadline.
Yeah, but what would you know about that? What would you know about that as a former litigation and investigations lawyer who also worked as a Crown Court judge?
Thank you. In any event, at the time, I felt that Theresa May was marking what was going to be a slippery slope. I have to say I never thought it would be quite as massive a slippery slope as we've been on. But, she tried to sort things out by making Boris Johnson her foreign secretary, and we saw what happened there.
That went well.
And I mean, she just started this whole process. She opened the door for what was going to happen next. And every time, each of them opens the door for someone who does even worse and tells even more lies.
Like a Russian doll of ridiculous, a Russian doll of awfulness, isn't it?
It's so depressing.
It really is. Did you enjoy your brief celebrity?
Well, it was a bit alarming because I didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, the Daily Mail was saying I ought to be the new next Prime Minister. But I thought the thing to do was go on holiday and get away from it.
Yes.
So I did. But I do have an Instagram that's called Yellow Jacket Woman, which I have to say, since it's become X, I've stopped posting on.
No, of course. No, but this is, I'm going to dig out that speech, actually, and remind people of it. Because, I mean, well, actually, I can ask you, forgive me for using this phrase, but as a woman, I can ask you whether or not you recognise I think Diana gets a Ray Liotta, doesn't she, Keith? Don't you think? I mean, it doesn't get much better than this. We're having a conversation about whether or not we should feel sorry for Theresa May and the Yellow Jacket Woman who went truly viral 5 years ago. I think, and actually the public have spoken. There's a Ray Liotta on the way. But do you understand what I mean when I say, as a bloke, that I find it a little bit hard to go in with my studs up on Theresa May in a way that I simply don't suffer from with Boris Johnson, for example? And you didn't suffer from that problem at all, clearly.
I mean, I can see, looking back, Theresa May had a level of integrity that has not been repeated since. But actually, she just got it wrong. She got it badly wrong. She put party before country. She had this fixation about hostile environment for immigrants. She started this entire ball rolling. And she let women down, is all I can say.
I can't say fairer than that, and it certainly earns you one of these.
I'm Ray Liotta, and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
Feature.
If you build it, they will come.
Diana, good. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, James. Always enjoyed your show. Thanks.
Lovely
Bye.
to hear. It's 10:47. 10:51 is the time. Are you kidding me? I've only just drawn breath. So I feel my list is barely even started. I probably spent too long playing all our old sound effects for features that I've forgotten about, even though they were brilliant ideas at the time. Keith, can we start a feature on features I've forgotten about, even though they were brilliant ideas at the time, please? Can we get like a zoom features that were brilliant ideas, even though I've forgotten about them and they were brilliant ideas at the time, or something? Zoom like that, no? Oh, all right then. Be like that. So I haven't even started putting my list together. Hostile environment is obvious, but I'd forgotten about... I mean, this is a really good point, actually. David Hellier taking things a little more seriously, perhaps, than we have been doing so far, which is a mistake. Although Diana obviously reminded us how seriously she was taking this question of feeling sorry for Theresa May as long ago as 2019, and we will, I think, remind ourselves of that. Famous question time, truly famous question time contribution shortly. But Dave puts it like this from Nuneaton. Love the show, thank you. May was bad because she was weak. When she had that 48-52 divide, she made no attempt to find a solution other than the one that the populist right wanted. It was her attempt to control them, yes, but once they overwhelmed her, she was swept aside, finding herself watching as parliamentary standards crumbled. All right, here it comes, Dave. That's it, mate. That is why I do have a scintilla of sympathy for Theresa May. Because she thought, as a lot of people have thought over the years, she thought that you could sate that appetite. She thought, because of who she is, for all of the faults that we're listing and will continue to list, she thought that there must be, at the root of this, there must be a semblance of rationality. So there must come a point where facts will trump feelings, where policy will be more important than performative posturing. Policy will be more important than posturing. But reality will trump rhetoric. So that's why she did the things that she did, because she thought, if I can keep these people on a leash, then they won't tear us all to shreds, either the party or the country or each other. And of course, because you're dealing with something built on lies and emotion, you couldn't. It was never going to reach the roots of rationalism. So she did all of these things to try to keep it sweet, to try to keep Johnson at bay, to try to keep the... I'm sorry, I don't have the words anymore to describe the idiocy, the dangerous, delinquent, nation-damaging idiocy of people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and the rest of them, Nadine Dorries. She thought that you could somehow satiate them when, of course, their appetites were insatiable because they were built upon prejudice and rhetoric and feeling and emotion. So that's how I can kind of feel sorry for her. Alex in Leicester. Alec, what would you like to say?
I think you've nailed it on the head from my point of view, but I think you've been really harsh. I think a couple of callers have been really on her. She came in a position of going to do a job when she was up. You look at who she was up against when she was in the election. She was up against Leadsom, Gove and Fox.
Yeah, that's true.
So she knew the danger. There was no one else. Everyone else was looking around the room going, who wants the job? No one wanted the job apart from the really strong Brexiters, and she knew what that meant for the party. Okay, they've dragged it out a little bit longer than necessary.
Yeah, but you see...
her whole role was duty. Honestly, her whole role was duty.
Oh, you're a good man, Alec. You really are. And I don't think you're wrong, necessarily, but you can't avoid the fact that it couldn't have gone worse. Even from the perspective of what she was trying to prevent happening, it happened.
Her worst thing is she came out and went, Brexit means Brexit. And so she's stuck. As soon as she came out and said that, the Brexiteers were great because, we got her on side. And
that was what got us the steal of the New Iron Lady front page, I think. I think it was the Brexit means Brexit moment. So the Brexit means Brexit, and then the red lines, and then the citizens of nowhere. Do you remember that? Which was a real lump of red meat for the jingoistic or the xenophobic wing of the party.
And also, remember, her cabinet was falling apart. I think she had 8-9 resignations inside 2 years.
So you're managing objectivity here, I think, properly, aren't you? And you're saying, you know, she might be awful in many, many ways, but this is the task that she set and accepted. This is the challenge she accepted, and that alone is worthy of respect.
Yeah, the challenge of that it was a party she knew where it was going. I think she did her best to turn it, but she knew she couldn't get a Brexit deal that would suffice the Brexiteers. And don't forget, she was looking from a point of view of, this is what the country's voted for. I need to do damage limitation. She was a damage limitation Prime Minister.
A damage limitation Prime Minister who could never say out loud that what she was presiding over was damaging.
Yeah, because then her home party would revoke.
Because she had to say it's a brilliant idea. I can't believe I voted. I mean, what she did, Truss then took and times by 1,000, didn't she?
Yeah, and she never believed in any of them. You kind of look at the work she's done in Parliament at the moment, where I think Boris Johnson made his speech and she kind of said it's an awful decision and it's not the Brexit we should be voting for.
I mean, this is a voice of reason. It doesn't cancel out all of the stuff on the other side of the scales by any stretch of the imagination, but this is where on an emotional level, the scintilla of sympathy that I feel comes from physical moments. It comes from the dancing on the stage. It comes from the cough, which oddly, as a tribute to Theresa May, I'm suffering from a bit of a cough today. I don't know whether you've noticed. I need one of those Jakeman's cherry menthol drops. They're quite nice. But I can't eat that sorry, this doesn't matter, does it, in the great scheme of things? So this is my little tribute to Theresa May. I have a little cough today. That makes you feel sorry for her. The stuff falling off the back of the thing makes you feel sorry for her. But we have been reminded by Yellow Jacket Woman, star of Question Time in 2019, we have been reminded in glorious fashion why we should not feel sorry for her. And I think the quality of Alec's call demands that we remind ourselves once again why we should not feel sorry for Theresa May.
The woman in the yellow jacket.
Two things. Firstly, could we get over feeling sorry for Theresa May?
Do you never feel sorry for her?
It's not...
Hang on. Do you never feel sorry for her?
No, I don't feel sorry for her. She's the woman who, for many, many years, has led the hostile environment for migrants in this country, which resulted in the Windrush generation. It's a disgrace. She's the person who created her very specific red lines on immigration in the ECJ, which have created the negotiation mess that we're in. She triggered Article 50 when she had no plan. And as to criticising the EU on this, there are 27 other countries in the EU. They have been completely united on this. We do not even have a cabinet that can unite, and definitely a government that isn't in control of the process. They are a body of rules and regulations, and they are not going to break that when it's the most successful single market in the world, and all around the world people want to do deals with the EU. We are going to lose all of that, and it is ridiculous for us, with our hopeless government who cannot get it together to actually work out what the will of the people is today in 2019, to blame the EU and to go around feeling sorry for Theresa May. I'm sorry.
Listen to that. Round of applause. And now she got a Ray Liotta as well. But good Lord, has one contribution to Question Time ever secured so many plaudits? Brickbats, I very much doubt it. I don't know. Let's see what we feel like after the news, shall we? Because at the moment, I don't think we've come up with Theresa May's biggest disaster or the worst thing that she did. We could get a little bit more nuanced on this and look at that challenge, that difficulty of trying to deliver what it was that she charged herself with trying to deliver. But other stories that I'm drawn to include a collapse, I believe, genuinely, of the railway system. And I really like that story that Sheila talked about yesterday. The school checking on whether or not pupils have actually gone on holiday when they're claiming that they're off sick. And how far could a school reasonably go without upsetting you? It is 3 minutes after 11. That didn't go in quite the way I wanted it to go. Well, I loved the way it went, but it wasn't the way I intended it to go. It was all quite knockabout, wasn't it, that analysis of Theresa May's legacy? I want now to move you into slightly more personal and detailed territory. So not the overviews, not the if you like the retrospective analyses of her performance as a politician, which I think we did a cracking job of pinning down. But I want instead to look at some of the individual instances of her legacy. I want particularly to hear from you if you were affected by the things that she did. So a police officer, do you remember the police officer who stood up at the Police Federation conference and told her in terms that the policies she was pursuing were going to damage community policing? And by community policing, he meant the practice of officers being on streets in communities, finding out if there were concerns about Dirty Gertie at number 30, or if they were worried that there may be some young people showing signs of radicalisation at number 74, and all of those things he cited. He had been Community Policeman of the Year, and I just want to make this distinction. I'm not sure it's necessary, but it might be. A distinction between, because I say community policing and you might think of a police community support officer, a PCSO. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about full fat coppers whose job was to police communities, and not from an exclusively stick perspective, but also from a carrot one, to get to know communities. And he stood up at the Police Federation conference. I used to play this clip all the time because I thought it was really important, although I guess I am the Cassandra of current affairs in this country. I keep telling you about what's going to happen if you don't change course, and we crack on and do it anyway. So he literally gave a speech at the Police Federation conference warning about what was going to happen. Was he not announcing that he was leaving the force? He'd been Community Police Officer of the Year a couple of years previously. I think we spoke to him on the programme. It's hard to remember what was going on, wasn't it, before the madness of 2016 kicked in and boiled all our brains. And then, of course, it emerged that the Manchester Arena bomber, the terrorist who blew up that concert at the Manchester Arena, had been in the neighbouring borough. So he literally warned about the dangers of cutting community policing while she was giving speeches telling coppers to stop crying wolf. And I in a grim coincidence, the community adjacent to the one that this officer used to look after was the one in which that Manchester bomber hailed from. I think it was the one next door. Joe's been in touch to say, wasn't it the same beat where the Manchester Arena bomber came from? Memory serves, Joe. It was adjacent, very much the same area, but not quite the same beat. So you have that. I had a couple of messages on social media this morning from people. One in particular caught my eye, from someone whose grandmother was nearly deported as a consequence of Windrush. I think that had Theresa May's fingerprints all over it. If you're ready to talk about this, and you can, what was it like when she failed to turn up at Grenfell in the first instance? Do you remember? She wasn't there. She wasn't there. One of the, I think still for me, one of the most incomprehensible collisions between political and personal that we've ever witnessed. I will never forget taking calls in the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell Tower tragedy from people who didn't know where to go. People whose homes had been destroyed, whose families had been thrown into complete disarray, who had, of course, quite possibly lost family members. And it was local communities, churches and mosques in particular, that essentially dealt with much of the aftermath. Kensington and Chelsea Council, absent in many ways. And when national government was afforded an opportunity to step into the vacuum of leadership that had been left by the local council, it took Theresa May, if memory serves, several days even to turn up at Grenfell, whether from fear of her reception or a more general cowardice, I do not know. But if you feel ready to talk about that, the number you need is 03456060973. So I want to know how her periods in power, whether at the Home Office or as Prime Minister, I want to know how they affected you. I want to know what you are going to remember. And I want you to tell me on 03456060973. So we've got Windrush, and I don't think on this programme we cover Windrush enough. I know we cover it more than anybody else, but that's not really the point, is it? If certain corners of the media aren't covering it at all, then we have a kind of responsibility here to cover it even more. But we need a little bit of help on fully understanding what she did to your family. So as a Windrush family, what did Theresa May do to you? Broader questions about the hostile environment, the way in which once it was a relatively straightforward process to come here to work, to start paying taxes, to slot effortlessly into society. But they wanted to make it harder. They wanted to make it a more hostile environment. Rhetorically speaking, when she talked about the citizens of nowhere, how did that impact on you? But in terms of policy specifics, I'm thinking Windrush. In terms of political decisions, I'm thinking Grenfell. In terms of, slightly more, she put Chris Grayling in charge of probation, didn't she? Or did she? Was that David Cameron? I know that her and Chris Grayling, because this is in The Secret Barrister's last book, were responsible for making it much harder for people to receive compensation if it turned out that they'd been wrongfully convicted. I'm just looking at all sorts of things. I'm looking at all sorts of things to essentially assemble the proper legacy for a woman who, in a country where the media is so right-wing now, it's forgotten what way is up and what way is down. You think I'm exaggerating? I refer you back to the front page of today's Daily Express. Brexit is a great British success story worth billions. In a media that's as bent as that, Theresa May's legacy is unlikely to be properly assembled, except by voters, all right? So tell me how her periods in power, whether at the Home Office or in Downing Street, affected you. 03456060973 is the number that you need. It's 11 minutes after 11. I'll remind you, actually, because coppers... I mean, we've got a story bubbling under today about people leaving the army in their droves, an exodus of officers, an exodus of soldiers from the army causing huge problems for the future. But I mean, coppers as well. That idea that she, through cuts, not just through creating an atmosphere which you no longer wanted to be in, but through deliberate cuts to the police service, arguably that is the greatest legacy of Theresa May, because she wasn't going to be able to stop the tides of Brexit. She probably wasn't going to be able to stop Brexit being implemented in the worst imaginable ways, because it was always going to be decided or ruled over by people who didn't understand any of it. You know, the world in which Jacob Rees-Mogg could become Secretary of State for Business or a Minister for Brexit Benefits. These are people who understood nothing. I'm not sure she was ever going to be able to stop that. So if you remove the unicornism from her legacy and look instead at the impact, I wonder whether it is the police service, what she did to the police as Home Secretary under the cloak of austerity, that will be her longest legacy, her ugliest legacy. I could be wrong. I'll remind you of some of those moments, actually. This is possibly the most extraordinary thing about her period as Home Secretary was the argument that if you reduce the number of police officers, you will not reduce the quality of policing on the streets or in the country. This was in May 2015. First public speech since being reappointed as Home Secretary after that general election. The Police Federation was screaming from every street corner you could imagine that if you cut numbers, things will get worse. But Theresa May knew better.
This weekend, the Federation warned that spending reductions mean that we'll be forced to adopt a paramilitary style of policing in Britain. Today, you've said that neighbourhood police officers are an endangered species. I have to tell you that this kind of scaremongering does nobody any good. It doesn't serve you, it doesn't serve the officers you represent, and it doesn't serve the public. In 2002, you said David Blunkett had done more harm to the police in 5 minutes than others have taken years to do. In 2004, you said Labour were going to destroy policing in this country forever. And in 2007, you said the government had betrayed the police. Now, I disagree with Labour policies, but even I don't think those things are true. You said police officers were demoralised in 2002, 2004, 2007 and 2012. You warned of police officers' anger in 2002, 2005 and 2008. And you warned that the police and the public were being put in danger in 2001, 2004 and 2007. The truth is that crime fell in each of those years. It's fallen further since, and our country is safer than it has ever been.
Extraordinary, really, to compare that with observable reality. Chris puts it very well. I'm an ordinary constable, close to retirement. This means I worked through a Labour administration and was able to compare directly with the police service before and after she became Home Secretary. Chalk and cheese, James. She oversaw the ruination of the service, from physical working conditions to pay, to pension and to public confidence. So let's look at the list. You can put anything you want on it. I've suggested Windrush, if that affected your family. I've suggested policing, if, like Chris, that describes you. I think that the failure even to appear in the immediate aftermath of Grenfell is something that really should haunt her to her dying days. But there'll be stuff we've missed off the list as well. So the things that Theresa May, as a politician, did to you. And don't be shy. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973. 18 minutes after 11 is the time, and the decision by Theresa May to leave Parliament, I can understand why you might not think it's as important as some of us are essentially behaving, but she's a former Prime Minister. I know we've had so many in the last few years that it feels like so what, but it's really, really important. You look at the legacy, particularly a Prime Minister who did actually win an election, albeit only just, then you have a sort of historical responsibility. But I'm conscious of the Theresa-abilitation that's underway and keen perhaps to address it slightly with rather more personal perspective. So it's how Theresa May, either as Home Secretary and or Prime Minister, directly affected your life, all right? James is in Chester. James, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. I'm calling because basically the hostile environment and also Brexit, but the hostile environment.
We can't blame her for Brexit.
Possibly. I mean, she presided over it a little bit, but yes. The hostile environment has really thrown a spanner in my life the last 18 months or so. I'm Australian by birth, but I'm a British citizen. I got my citizenship when I was 5 or 6, and I came to the UK with my parents. My father's British, and then I left when I was around 21, just after university. I went to live in Denmark for around 6 or 7 years. And then I had a life in Denmark. I had a partner. We had kids. And then about 2 years ago, I started getting very kind of homesick, basically. And I wanted to come back to the UK. And we've been unable to do that pretty much. We're currently living between Denmark and the UK in essence. So one of our children is British. Our youngest son, he was born in the UK, but our eldest is not British because I can't pass on my Britishness because I was born in Australia, and he wasn't born in the UK. Now, the reason we can't come back is I need to have a British job and a British income. I'm a small business owner. I run an online business in Denmark. In order to get a visa, either my partner needs to get a British job, and we've got a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they're a bit of a handful, and she hasn't been able to get a British job over the last few months.
And why are we confident that this is Theresa May's fault?
So in 2001, when my family came back to the UK jobless, my mother was not a British citizen. She was just able to come. Absolutely no questions.
So so the desperation to look as if they were being tough on immigration is going to catch people like you in this net, while for people who live and die by such statistics, while the overall figures have actually gone through the roof, and Brexit was sold to those people as a way of reducing them, they have actually tinkered with the red tape, as it were, to the detriment of British citizens like you.
Basically, yeah. I'm not saying that we deserve to come here any more than those people either. I'm really not what I'm...
But if you do, that's what citizenship is, though. It's not a question of deserving. It's a question of the rights that are bestowed by citizenship, isn't it?
Sure.
This is because your wife would have to be earning over a certain threshold, or your joint income would have to be over a certain threshold.
And it would have... Yeah, and it would have to be British. So I could move my business entirely to the UK, but then I'd have to wait 18 months. And on top of that, in order to get the visa, my partner would have to leave the UK for 6 months plus with the kids while the visa is sorted out, while I stay in the UK and work separately from her. On top of all of that.
And of course, the reason why this was a political decision is summed up in her phrase. You are a citizen of nowhere, aren't you?
Well, according to her,
yes.
I find that deeply offensive.
Well, I find it deeply offensive, and it wasn't even about me. But the idea that why should we be worrying about people who move around a lot? Why would that? That's what she was talking about. That's what she was saying, I think.
I think so. As people we've seen through the pandemic, people are able to work more online. They don't necessarily have to be tied into an office. The world is changing, but some people are desperate to keep us separate in our little boxes.
Well, it doesn't. I don't know what it was supposed to achieve, because the sort of red meat merchants are not really thinking about people like you when they demand that there is lower immigration. It's become increasingly clear over the years they're not really thinking about anybody real, they're, except a few extreme examples and a sort of mythical hordes detailed in the pages of the Daily Mail. But the idea that anybody who wants less immigration wants people like you not to be able to move here is absurd. And yet
I can't even pay tax. I would love to be able to pay British tax, for example. Instead, I'm now looking for a British job. I'm going to have to continue running my Danish business, wind it down a bit if I manage to be successful in getting a British job, and take quite a large pay decrease and pay substantially less tax to the British state than I otherwise would be happy to do.
It's a very strange way of doing business, isn't it? And you're right, I think, to lay it at her door. It makes a mockery of claims to family values, or being the party of family, or caring about all the things that growing up even I believed that the Conservative Party did actually care about. I wish you well, James. I hope things improve. 24 after 11 is the time. Roger is in Wembley. Roger, what would you like to say?
Just when Theresa May was in office as Home Secretary, my daughter was a serving police officer on active duty. And if you remember at the time, a few years ago, when the 2 female officers were shot and killed in Manchester, trying to arrest a suspect. Well, a few weeks after the funeral, my daughter came home and she asked if we have a quiet word. And she took me into another room away from the family. Yeah. And she said, I want you to make me a promise. I said, what is it? And it's unusual. She's particularly serious. She says, if I get killed in the line of duty, will you promise me to keep Theresa May away from my funeral? I don't want that woman anywhere near me when I die. And that was it came as such a shock, because she's not she used to tell me some of the things that happened at work that kept me, didn't want my wife to know a lot of it.
Yes, of course. I understand.
The difficult things.
Yes.
But yeah, she just asked me to make that promise, and that was just indicative of how the police really did hate Theresa May, and especially after what happened with that funeral of those poor officers. She used it as a media opportunity, I think, and it's just.
I'm sure she. I mean, I'm not going to argue with you or your daughter, but I don't. I mean, it's a fairly sweeping accusation to say that she'd used it as a media opportunity. Because as Home Secretary, if she hadn't turned up, we probably would be remembering that now in the way that we remember her failure to turn up at Grenfell, Roger. But I'm not defending her. You know that.
I'll apologise for saying that.
No, you don't have to apologise. You don't have to apologise. You had to deal with that extraordinary request from your daughter, which opens up all manner of contemplations that no parent would ever want to endure, and that's perfectly reasonable. But I would just say if she hadn't turned up, she'd have probably got into more trouble than.
Yeah, I just never realised that officers. I mean, I've had police officers in my family for decades, in various branches of my family. But to hear my own daughter say that she felt so strongly about Theresa May and how and what she was doing to the police force and lack of support. That it was a shock to me.
Well, I bet it was. And it will be a shock to people listening, although possibly less so to police families, less so to police officers familiar with the resentment that you describe, familiar with the bitterness that you describe towards someone who did that thing that is almost impossible to get your head around. Or even under the cloak of austerity, even at a time when the Conservatives were dedicated to the idea that the best way to improve public services would be to starve them of funds. And we're seeing the consequences of that now, of course, with councils going bankrupt up and down the country potentially. But to say to a police officer that the quality of policing is not affected by the quantity of police, I mean, even saying those words now, years later, is extraordinary. The quality of policing is not affected by the quantity of police. We're going to cut police numbers and it won't affect police. And the Conservative Party's come full circle like it has on so many things, boasting now about increasing police numbers while hoping that you won't remember they were responsible for cutting them in the first place. Same party, a lot of the same people, some of them in the similar positions. And yet there it is. I mean, a timely reminder, if you like, of the reality that police officers have to deal with. Paul's in Bromley. Paul, what would you like to say?
Hello, hi.
Hello,
just a quick one, really, just to tell you a little bit how I've been affected when she was Home Secretary. I mean, I have no word to describe this person. I can't use it in national radio. But I came here as an immigrant. My wife was EU citizen from France.
Yes.
And I applied to have, obviously, the confirmation of my right to work. So I sent the application to the post. I wait 4 months. I don't even have any confirmation of a letter saying, look, you apply. I have to make a complaint to her department, a serious complaint. And then through the investigation of that complaint, they send me a confirmation of application. This is how hostile. I have to wait 9 to 10 months before even having any document to travel. Because I was an EU citizen, I couldn't get out of the country. So he was like, in a small jail. So I couldn't get out of the country. I was walking around with a letter. It was really, really difficult. I mean,
but that is it. I don't think people fully appreciated what hostile environment meant. It literally meant make it harder for people to live normal lives in this country, dependent on their country of birth, dependent on their origins. Not even, we haven't even touched on deportations, which would be closer to the Windrush thing. People who essentially denied NHS access because they were being accused of being illegal immigrants because they simply had never got around to doing the paperwork 10, 30, 40, 50 years ago, Paul, that you were trying to do while she was actually in the Home Office. It is extraordinary. I like this from Paul, who's in Leicester. He just writes, and it means our work here is done probably, blimey. And here was me thinking that Theresa May was a moderate. I've got to sort my memory out. Don't worry, Paul, that's what we're here for. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. It is 26 minutes to 12 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I don't know that I say this often enough, but you can have two ideas in your head at the same time. So it can be simultaneously true that Theresa May was probably the least bad of the last 5 prime ministers, and that she was bloody awful. I don't know whether that's unfair on David Cameron. I don't think it is, personally. Anything that Theresa May did as Home Secretary is essentially on David Cameron because he made her Home Secretary. So she can be the least awful of Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak, but she can still be absolutely awful. And some of the stories we've heard already rather prove that point, don't they? And we may hear a couple more. But I do also this hour want to get up to speed on what this island, essentially, that Joe Biden announced he is going to be building on the coast of Gaza to help get aid into that benighted territory, and an extraordinary story. I wonder if you can guess who it is. If I could I've just talked about the last 5 Conservative prime ministers. If I told you that it has emerged in the last few hours that one of them, on a flight while in office, not necessarily in the Prime Minister's office, but in office, one of the politicians whose names have popped up today, one of the last 5 politicians to become Prime Minister in the last 5 Tory administrations, managed to spend more than £15,000 on in-flight catering for a single trip to Australia. Which one would you think it was? See, this is what I mean about Theresa May, okay? I tell you, so there are 5 names. I give you David Cameron. I give you Theresa May. I give you Boris Johnson. I give you Liz Truss. I give you Rishi Sunak. And if I said to you that one of them had such an overweening sense of entitlement that they ran up a £15,000 in-flight catering bill on a single flight to Australia, I would be fairly confident that it was not Theresa May. That's the nicest thing I can say about her today. Who do you think it would have been? We'll find out shortly after 12:45 today. Which one of those 5? Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak. Who on earth could be so entitled and so contemptuous of public money that they could run up as much money as Michelle Donnellan spends, as much taxpayers' money as Michelle Donnellan spends on clearing up her own libels on in-flight entertainment on a flight to Australia, or in-flight catering on a flight to Australia? But back to Theresa May's true legacy. Terry's in Gravesend. What is it for you, Terry?
Yeah, I was in a Met during her reign as Home Secretary, and when she took, I think it was about 400 million off the budget for the Met on one occasion, clearly the Met had to cut back somehow. They got rid of quite a lot of civilian staff who were doing vital work, prepping papers for court and that sort of, arranging witnesses. Who's left to do it?
Well, you tell me. It's a rhetorical question, isn't it? Really? I mean, I suppose on the plus side, Terry, it takes so long to get to court these days that they don't really need any paperwork if it's going to be 5 years hence. They're probably waiting for it all to be done by unicorns or digitally or something like that. But it is a huge... What's the word? Just a diminishment of what used to be taken for granted in the context of the public sector.
Indeed. I say, and people say, oh, civilian staff and what have you. They did an outstanding job, and we relied on them quite heavily. And then they're taken away from you.
And then the same people that were cheering on the cuts are now complaining that you can't get police officers to attend incidents because in some cases they'll be too busy doing the paperwork that was previously done by the civilian staff. It's almost like these things are linked, isn't it?
Yeah, you might think so.
It's extraordinary. No, thank you, mate. I think the police, actually, looking at my inbox as well as my switchboard, the police are probably the ones who have the biggest beef, if you like, with the idea of the Theresa-bilitation that is understandably underway across much of the British media today. Seth's in Tunbridge Wells. Seth, what would you like to say?
I'm really sorry I'm going to have to make you insert that message about the Samaritans, but my friend's uncle, Clive, went to Jamaica for a funeral.
Yes.
And trying to come back, he was told by the airline that he didn't have, because the airline was doing the vetting for the Home Office, that he didn't have the right, in their instructions, he didn't have the right to return to the UK. He'd been here since he was 5 years old. This went backward and forward for a while. The Jamaican government tried to help out. Nobody could get Theresa May's minions, who've decided to turn the Home Office from a processing and administrative centre to one that only looks for ways to reject and make life miserable. Nobody could help. And Clive committed suicide in Kingston. I'm sorry, but That's what happened.
Okay, I understand now. I was a bit confused by your trigger warning at the beginning of this call, Seth, but you were right to provide it, and I'm glad that you did. And I will remind people of the Samaritan's phone number at the end of this conversation. But and the Samaritans are always absolutely clear that no single event is ever the full and complete story of why somebody would choose to end their own life. But you are talking about somebody who reached the end of their tether while being treated deliberately in the way that you describe.
I think Clive had come here when he was 5 or 6 years old.
And how old was he when he died, Seth? How old was he when he passed?
He passed. Clive must have been about late 60s, early 70s. He'd only gone for a funeral. It was only a funeral in Kingston. He went to in Spanish Town and in Kingston when nothing else was working, and he was staying outside somebody's house at the back of someone's house.
Yeah.
He had no money. Everybody here that had sent was sending, and then sometimes you get money in Jamaica, and because you get money from the UK, or because they know you've been deported from the UK or blocked from returning to the UK, there are certain elements that feed off of you, like parasites. And the man was insecure after spending his entire life here.
And he didn't have a support structure in Jamaica.
Nothing.
It's not as if he had a second family living there waiting to look after him. His entire life was here. His entire life was here.
Mrs. May's home office and the hostile environment meant that they had taken away his medication, they had taken away his home, they had made his employer fire him while he was in Jamaica. While he was making his applications back to the UK, his employer withdrew his employment. He'd lost his medication from the NHS. He wasn't getting any fund, and even his bank cards couldn't work in Jamaica anymore because they blocked his bank account. What is he going to do? This is why Mrs. May created an environment and an office where people went home on the weekend to their families, but her minions went home and tried to find ways to make people's lives more miserable. You go home to your daughters and your wife. These people go home to try to find ways to make life more miserable and to reject people for the simple reason of being born in a different place.
I have no words to describe what you've just told, to respond to what you've just told me. It's not a story I've come across before, obviously, but and elements of it may be extraordinary, but the subtext of it, the baseline of it, is far from unique, as you know. People who had known no other home, waking up as a consequence of an employment check or an NHS encounter, or leaving the country for what they thought was a holiday or a visit to a funeral, suddenly discovering that the Home Office had decided in its wisdom that they weren't actually British, or that they had no right to be in the only country that they'd ever called home. It's extraordinary, actually, Seth, how... What's the word I'm looking for? A couple of texts coming in saying, when do we get our post office programme? I know there have been dramatisations of the Windrush experience, but there hasn't been, has there, the sense of public outrage at the treatment of people like Clive and countless others that we have seen belatedly in other areas of British life, whether it's Hillsborough or whether it's the post office sub-postmasters or the tainted blood scandal. What family did Clive have here? Did he have children? You said he was your friend's uncle, I think.
Yeah, he was my friend's. He was my friend's uncle, and he tried to help as much as possible. But that's the other thing. If you're deported to some countries, you're okay, you're fine. But you get deported to Jamaica, blocked. He wasn't even deported.
He was deported de facto, except he paid for his own flight, and they wouldn't let him back in again.
Yeah. And that's part of the hostile environment, that you have airlines and you have landlords and you have banks and you have everybody else, NHS, everybody working against you for the simple reason being that you're different.
And this idea that, this was it, wasn't it? It was born of the Daily Mail and Rupert Murdoch, the idea that the country was full of people who'd sort of come here under false pretences and were simultaneously stealing our jobs and also living on benefits and also sending all the money back home, these sort of triple whammies of mythologies. And because you can't actually fight a non-existent enemy, they turned people like Clive into an enemy and punished him in the way that you describe. I hate that story, mate. That is one of the worst things I've ever heard in the 20 years that I've been presenting this programme.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I really am. And the number for Samaritans, which I think we all understand now, why Seth referenced it at the beginning of that contribution, is 116123, and they're available 24 hours a day for anybody in emotional distress, struggling to cope, or indeed at risk of suicide throughout the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. And if you don't fancy speaking to a volunteer, who are always on the end of the phone lines, there are other methods, including email as well. If you just head to Samaritans.org, you can find out all of those avenues as well. There you go. Talk about legacy now. 11:48 is the time. Here's something I've never had to do before, and I haven't even told him that I'm about to do it, so I suspect his ears in the newsroom will be pricking up imminently and indeed immediately. I need to apologise for something that Thomas Watts did during his news bulletin. I've received at least 3 complaints. And what Thomas did, apparently, and I didn't notice myself, was he unwittingly inserted a pregnant pause in the middle of one of the stories that appeared in the 11:30 news. And the pregnant pause followed the words that Britain is to join the EU. and V and Adam and many others, actually, more than 3, all suffered a little at that moment. V says, "Oh my God, your newsreader just said Britain is to join the EU," and then paused before adding, "and the US, etc." I think he may have given me a heart attack. And Adam writes, "When Tom was reading the news and said Britain to join the EU and then paused before completing the sentence, I thought I'd somehow missed a complete U-turn on Brexit overnight and that the last couple of years were just a bad dream." So, we certainly don't need to apologise on Thomas's behalf, but my goodness me, I will. That's not fair, is it? Talk about leading a horse to water and not letting it have a drink. But there you go. So I've often said to you that the best bit of radio is the silence. The pauses, the silence can sometimes be louder than words, louder than bombs. And there's a very, very good example of it. I didn't notice that myself at the time, but my goodness me, you did. It is 10 to 12. It's solve a problem and possibly open up another one. This first, you could cover this story in quite a light-hearted fashion, or light-handed fashion, but light-hearted. And then, of course, you will probably start thinking halfway through treating it in a light-hearted fashion that it's anything but. I'd remind you that the phrase magic money tree has popped up a few times on today's programme as we resist the exhortations to rehabilitate the reputation of Theresa May. The magic money tree, remember when a nurse who hadn't had a pay rise for 8 years raised her plight with Theresa May. She was told there's no magic money tree that you can shake things from. This week we've learned that Michelle Donnellan, who's still the Secretary of State for Science, spent £15,000 of your money settling a libel that she made completely voluntarily on Twitter. I learned last night that she received legal advice before posting the libelous tweet, but we won't be allowed to see what the legal advice was, unless presumably a Freedom of Information request kicks in and focuses her mind on the issue in the same way that Freedom of Information requests focused her mind on the issue earlier this week and prompted her to reveal that it was actually £15,000 worth of our money that was spent on settling that libel case, although I don't think that the legal fees were included in that. Peter Gagan, as you know, is a master of the Freedom of Information requests, and I suspect it may have been one of those that has prompted another revelation from his organisation. Peter, of course, an investigative journalist at the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. Democracy for Sale is his Substack, and he joins us now. I did a little quiz earlier, and 2 things happened, Peter. I suggested that people should try to guess who had run up an enormous bill on Inflight catering during a journey to Australia out of the last 5 prime ministers, albeit that it hadn't happened during their premiership. And it also, the same little quiz, prompted a response from Simon Calder, the doyen of travel journalists, of course, that this isn't necessarily the worst offence committed by the offender that you're about to reveal to us. But I can tell you, my listeners, whether because they've already seen the story or because they have great powers of perspicacity, they all guessed correctly. So tell us what happened and tell us who it was.
So your listeners, James, will not be shocked to hear that we're talking about the former Prime Minister, Liz Truss. Short-lived, but former Prime Minister nonetheless.
Yeah, the title stands. She's even got it on the front of her new book, mate.
And, well, as Politico revealed earlier this week, she spent more than £15,000 on in-flight catering during a single trip to Australia when she was running the Foreign Office. So when she was Foreign Minister, they went on a private jet to Australia. There was 12 government representatives, and it cost a cool £1,400 per head. It's a long journey, but I think a lot of people would still find that quite a surprising bill to be landed with a single trip to Australia.
Well, how many people were in her entourage?
There was 12 representatives, so there was 12. So it was quite a very hefty bill for a single trip.
And this was the trip she took. This is what Simon Calder has reminded me of, because I think it was his story for the Independent back in January of 2022. Is that there were chartered jets. There were normal flights. There were scheduled flights available, but she decided to charter her own jet for this journey.
Oh yes, of course. Yeah, instead of I would say of course, but yeah, there were chartered flights. Exactly that. Instead of just chartered flights, you could have taken on that. You could have sat in a plane like any of the rest of us and had been fed on the plane. But instead, these were special flights put on just for Liz Truss and her entourage.
Qantas go every day. Qantas departures every day, and 235 passengers on a normal plane. But the one that they chartered is kitted out with a VIP interior, including lie flat beds. So, I mean, you could do one or the other. You could either sleep for the entire journey and justify it, or you could eat for the entire journey and justify it. But to do both, to be running up a 15 grand catering bill and a £500,000 charter a private jet bill, is frankly extraordinary. Why does it matter? Why do we still care, Peter? Why is it still news, albeit not everywhere?
Well, one of the most interesting aspects of this story, James, is that this trip took place in January 2022. And as you say, lots of journalists, like myself, use the FOI Act a lot. And as an aside, Michelle Donlan, I'd actually already put in my request before she came out with the bill. So, yeah, I can see what prompted her. There was probably more than one of us as well who came in with that request. But back in 2022, Emily Thornby, as she's just said earlier today, put in a request to the Labour Party for some information about this, and this was batted backwards and forwards between the Cabinet Office, which was held at. They said we don't have the information. Well, it was the Foreign Office initially, and then the Cabinet Office. We don't have the information. We don't have it in the form you needed, etc., etc. So for 2 years, and if anybody is a journalist like I using the FOI Act, it's really hard to get out information on the government. It's actually never been harder. But eventually, 36 hours ago, this information was released. But unusually in this case, normally if I put in an FOI request, the information is sent to me.
Right.
In this case, that doesn't seem to be what happened. Emily Thornby is saying that instead of the information being sent to her, it was sent to the news desk of a media organisation that subsequently published it and took comment from her, etc. But that's a very unusual way, and it's just worth remembering what was on Wednesday, James. It was the budget.
It was. It was indeed the budget. So the timing you're suggesting was designed to be overshadowed.
Well, this is actually what Emily Thornby suggested earlier today. She said that she felt that this is exactly what was happened. Was this story was put out intentionally on the Wednesday? This information, 2 years, 2 years she's had this request in, and it does seem slightly surprising that the very day you decide to release this information, slightly out of the blue, is the very day we have the budget.
Have you ever flown by private jet?
I haven't, James. I feel like I should.
Right, we should charter one for research purposes. Have you ever turned left on an aeroplane?
I haven't. I'm not sure I've done that either.
No, I'm not sure. I think I did once because someone was listening to the show and they got us an upgrade on the way back from America. But I don't want to sound like, a church mouse. But how do you run up such an enormous... I mean... most of the flights I go on, you have to pay for the Inflight catering these days. The days of getting a nice free meal are a bit behind us. But how do you run up a sort of over £1,000 per head on a catering bill on a single flight? I mean, what would you order? Is it caviar? I mean, is it that if you book a private jet, then everything's really, really expensive anyway? It's like going to that place with the bloke who sprinkles the salt from 10 feet in the sky, that Bay person. What's his name? Salt Bay. So I'm speaking gibberish to you, aren't I? But you've got no idea who Salt Bay is, have you, Peter?
I do. I've seen the beef thing. I think right. I've seen this on the internet.
You pay like £1 bazillion for a lamb chop or something like that in certain restaurants. What? I mean, do we know how you can run up a bill that big just on catering on a plane?
Well, I would suggest I could put in a freedom of information request, but given that this one has taken 2 years, I'm not sure that's going to be that helpful. 2 full years to ask. This is taxpayers' money as well. It's quite a simple question as well. How much did this cost?
Yes, and there it is. £15,639, 3.4% of the total cost of the tickets. So, I mean, maybe people listening spend time on private jets and they can tell us what it was that you need to order. Probably just loads of booze, do you think? They're probably absolutely mullered.
I couldn't possibly comment on that.
But I'm leading you into amateurish.
There's apparently actually, and interestingly, Emily Thornby said that she initially asked how much was spent on alcohol, and the government came back and said, after many months of fighting a freedom of information request, we don't have the breakdown, but all we know is how much was spent in total. So that was what eventually, 2 years later, the government revealed.
And while I have you, would you get a freedom of it? I mean, I don't know whether legal advice falls under this remit, does it? Because I discovered last night, as I'm sure you did as well, that Michelle Donnellan did actually get legal advice before publishing that libelous tweet about the academics that she accused of supporting Hamas, and then has spent £15,000, appropriately enough, coincidentally, given that's the figure under discussion here, on settling the case of taxpayers' money. And the current reluctance stroke refusal to make that legal advice public, would that fall? Would you get that as a consequence of a free, even if it took 264 years to do?
It should be. That is public information. There's such a clear public interest in that. It's public money.
So you think that, have you put it in yet then?
I have indeed, James. I did it yesterday.
Look at this. It's amazing. Like night follows day. This is extraordinary, like a well-oiled machine, Peter.
I'm waiting for the refusal as we speak, James. But if anybody wants, I will be publishing even the refusal on my Substack, because that's what I do too, because the only thing to do is to shame them.
Well, exactly that. And you're very good at not plugging your Substack, so I will do it for you. It is democracyforsale.substack.com. I'm thinking of starting a Substack, actually. Thank you, Peter. Peter Gagan, one of the great forces for good. I'm delighted that he's an increasingly regular presence on this programme. But I don't really want to do a politics Substack. Mrs. O'Brien says I should do a politics Substack. I don't want to do it. There's so many politics. Do you know what I want to do? I want to do a culture Substack. Because you love my recommendations for books and films and plays and stuff. I'd like to do that on Substack, but I don't know if there'd be an appetite for it. It's coming up to 12 noon. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I think we'll change course completely next and look at either the school that is checking families' bins, sending people around to see if their car's in the drive, to try and bust people for going on unsanctioned holidays, or the state of the railways. You decide. Drop me a note to tell me which you prefer. And you've spoken in your... I mean, seriously, it's not even close to 52-48. You are a lot more interested in railways and trains than you are in the story of the school that is checking bins and snooping in all sorts of ways to make sure that pupils who have signed off as absent are actually absent for real reasons, as opposed to having gone on an unsanctioned holiday, an unauthorised story. And actually, it was a piece in the I newspaper that turned my attention this morning to the state of the railways, coupled with my own life, because I'm catching a train later today, and I won't tell you where I'm going, because obviously I would be overwhelmed by autograph hunters at the station, and that would be embarrassing for everybody concerned. But I just read the headline: on the wrong track, 1,000 trains a day cancelled as railways crumble. And, I mean, the quick breakout is that the most unreliable train firms are getting worse. Avanti's average daily cancellations has gone up from 13 between April and November of last year to 31 between November of last year and February of this year. TransPennine has gone up from 19 to 20, Northern from 140 to 170, and Cross Country from 22 to 34. And it occurred to me for the first time that I no longer travel hopefully. Why is travelling hopefully a phrase? Do you know? Is it because it's a thing? It is a thing. It's a thing. When I used to do public speaking competitions, one of the titles one year was travelling hopefully. It's not the one that I did. I don't know what it means. I'm just asking you. Why is it a thing? It's a figure of speech. Travelling hopefully, and I realised that I no longer travel hopefully. I've always travelled hopefully. I travelled by train a lot. I only learnt to drive when my wife got pregnant, because I felt quite unreasonably, insisted that she wouldn't be able to drive herself to the labour ward when her waters broke. So I had to get a driving licence at the age of about 32, possibly 34, I should check. So I've never been a big driver, never had the petrol head gene. You may have noticed that this is unique among radio phone-in programmes for finding motoring topics almost mind-numbingly dull, even when the big motoring topic of the day is a direct consequence of this radio programme. I don't know if you're aware that a low traffic neighbourhood in somewhere, Streatham, has been suspended or something. It's all because of me. It's all because of me. It's all because of the pressure that we put on Sadiq Khan on Thursday when he was here for Speak to Sadiq, and as a direct consequence of that, they've now closed something somewhere about traffic, something, petrol, motors, cars, something. And some people are absolutely cock-a-hoop about this. Biggest story in town. And listen, I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek. Obviously, if you're caught up in an aberration of a low-traffic neighbourhood because the buses are travelling at slower than a snail's pace, then it's problematic on every imaginable level. But it's not interesting to listen to on the radio. And how long did it take you to get to Budgeons and back, Keith? 4 days. 400 years, man and boy, it took me to get to Budgeons and back. So anyway, I'll take all the credit for freeing up the streets of Streatham as a consequence of, actually it wasn't even me, it was a caller to the programme. Always get calls about low traffic neighbourhoods, never interesting, which is why we only ever do it when Sadiq Khan is in the studio to take your calls. So the point that I'm making is that I travel by public transport a lot more than you would expect for a major F-list celebrity like me. I am often to be found on buses. I am often to be found on the London Underground. And if I have a long journey to make, I am often to be found on proper trains, proper overground, intercity trains, as we used to call them. And I realised today, when I saw that headline and thought about what I'm doing later, I realised today that my relationship with the railways has changed. It's changed quite profoundly. So I responded to this story in a very personal fashion. And I found myself thinking, I don't know if I'm going to get where I want to go at anything like the time that I want to be there anymore. I had to go to Hay-on-Wye a few months ago for an appearance. I've been travelling by train a lot because of my book tour, and it's been about 50-50. I'd say I've never not ended up at the place where I wanted to be, but I've got there considerably later. And here's another thing I don't do anymore. And I grant you, this is quite a rarefied perspective on the issue. But if I can possibly avoid it, I go up the night before the gig or the day before the gig. I don't travel after the show to an event on the evening. I've done the radio show. I don't know whether you've noticed because I don't always mention it. I've done the radio show from some of our other studios around the country quite a lot in the last 6 months. I've done it from Glasgow. I've done it from Birmingham. I've done it from Bristol. It was great to catch up with Cormac McMahon, who was the newsreader when I started here at LBC, and he's now the head honcho down in the Bristol newsroom. But I've done it from a variety of Global's studio facilities up and down the country because I didn't want to run the risk of coming off air in London, hopping on a train to do the gig, and then hopping back on a train to get back. I didn't feel that could actually be guaranteed anymore. And I was right, because on a couple of occasions, even when I've gone to that trouble, even when I've been careful, I've got to my destination so late on the night before the event that I would never have been able to have done the event if I'd relied upon the trains getting there on time. So, what's the question? I'm not expecting anybody to ring in and talk about the plight of a best-selling author not being able to get to his book events on time because of the state of the trains. I'm looking at your relationship with the railways, and by that I mean either as a passenger or as a professional. I love the railways. I hate these topics because you almost inevitably find yourself blaming the forward-facing individuals. People who drive, despite the best effort of Rupert Murdoch and his foot soldiers over the last few years, I have got absolutely no problem with train drivers earning a decent scratch, and I think that other railway workers should have their wages increased as well. Because when I see the amounts of money making their way into the pockets of railway company shareholders and directors, I realise that industrial action to improve your own pay packet is in large part a consequence of railway companies doing what water companies have done, which is to suck out as much money as they humanly can from a former nationally owned resource in order to enrich investors and shareholders to the detriment not only of the service enjoyed by customers, but also of the men and women who work on that service. And they're the ones that get it in the neck every time things go wrong, every time things go badly. So what has happened? What has happened on the rails? How bad is it? do you recognise as a commuter or as a passenger or a punter, do you recognise what I describe? And your experience will be more profound than mine, because me relying upon trains to get me somewhere is essentially luxurious. You know, I've had the great privilege of taking a best-selling book on tour. It's not exactly the daily grind, is it? But you have changed your commute. You've moved. You cannot rely on the railway anymore in the way that you could, I think, even 5 years ago. But I want to hear your experience. And then, I mean, as a worker, how much has it changed as well? I mean, presumably for you now, it's a much more fraught experience than it was previously. You're dealing with very angry people, particularly people who are spending their entire journey with their face. And we're not talking about the Underground. You get on the London Underground during rush hour, you run the risk of spending 40 minutes with your face in somebody else's armpit. That's been an occupational hazard since I moved to London in 1991. There's nothing new about that on the London Underground. I always remember those photographs of the metro in Tokyo where they employ staff with cushions on sticks to push people, to cram people on to the... Do they still do that? They cram people on. I thought those pictures were extraordinary when I first saw them. They've got like a big sofa cushion on the end of a pole, and you use them to push people on, to cram them in just before the doors shut. So you're packed in to a railway carriage like sardines. And that's always been par for the course during rush hour on the London Underground. But now you could be packed into a carriage like that going all the way from London to Glasgow or from Bristol to Birmingham. It's extraordinary, the scenes that you see sometimes. So, what has it done to you? I suspect that the state of the railways has driven people back onto the roads at a time when we're supposed to be trying to cut down upon our carbon emissions. And if you work on the railways, now, I don't want you to laugh at me, but I think more than any other job, up to and including police officers, people who work on the railways, particularly train drivers and train guards, and I could be wrong, and you may well laugh at me, and I may end up regretting what I'm about to say for the rest of the programme. But I think more than almost any other job, except silly ones like being a footballer or an actor, I think working on the railways is actually a childhood dream come true for a lot of people. I genuinely think it's the same impulse that prompts people to start model railways. And that's, I mean, I don't know if you've seen Rod Stewart's model railway, but nothing brings out the inner schoolboy more than a model railway for some people. Something about railways appeals to something almost primeval within us and prompts a passion for the network, for the service. I remember there's a steam railway near where I grew up, and my old maths teacher, I went to go take the kids around the museum, my old maths teacher was there working as a volunteer. Just loves railways. People love railways. I don't know whether it's the same as why I love bridges. I love bridges because they somehow speak of man's dominion over nature. Bridges and cranes are my thing. They show that, cranes, because you've tamed nature. A crane is how you tame nature. It's how you turn nature to your own benefit. A crane is a way of defying physics. You look at a viaduct. You look at the viaduct in Stockport. And, that's Victorian. I mean, imagine what it would be if the Romans had built it. You look at a viaduct. It's a bloody canal in the sky, is what it is. It's absolutely extraordinary that human beings have managed to do that. To completely... Sorry, that's an aqueduct, you're quite right. A viaduct is obviously a road in the sky or a railway in the sky. But the nature of railways appeals to something within us that I think is close to primeval. And that's why I think people who work on railways, the incidence of people working on railways as the fulfilment of a childhood dream, I put it to you, my lords, ladies and gentlemen, I put it to you at this time that the incidence of people working on the railways who have fulfilled a childhood dream is higher than in any other job in this country. That's what I genuinely believe. More people working on the railways wanted to work on the railways when they were little than any other job, except possibly the army. Although we've got a story today about soldiers quitting the army in their droves. So I want to know what it's like to work on the railways and to not only observe this tragic decline, but to be an unwilling and unwitting part of it too. So there are two constituencies of caller that I am currently wooing. The first is the passenger. How has your relationship with the... I mean, I can't swear on the radio. If I could, I would say something like, how bleep are our... Just how bleeped are our railways? Just how completely and utterly bleeped are our railways? 03456060973. The second question is, what have you done? How have you changed it? Well, have you changed your life because you can't rely on the trains anymore? It might not sound like an interesting question, but get stuffed. It's my show, and I'm really interested in the answer. 03456060973. And then the third question is, you're working it. You're on there. Whether it's a fulfilment of your childhood dream or not, and I will ask, how does it feel? What's it actually like? I mean, you can also tell me how bad things really are, and possibly even the beginnings of the why, but you know how my mind works. I'm just interested in you. I want to know what it's like to be driving a train, which you've always dreamt of doing and you've always loved doing it, but you're doing it now on a network and a service that is, a pale shadow of what it used to be and what it should be. I quite like this. This is what I mean, you see, about trains, railways not being a normal job. As someone who has worked for 24 years, says Carl, as a guard, train driver, instructor, depot manager and now senior manager, I can tell you that a massive percentage of the issues faced by the railways is down to the industry being hoofed hither and thither across the skyline by politicians who are deliberately myopic when it comes to the systemic problems of the industry. Let's dig into those problems from the point of view of both passenger and professional after this. I love this. I wasn't making it up. I've been a railway signaller for nearly 20 years, James, and honestly, every day I come to work, I say I'm living the dream. I've been a railway enthusiast for my entire life. I'm over 40 now, and every day at work I get to play trains. I've even made a small model railway in the signal box, and I get to listen to you too. #living the dream. Please keep my name confidential. Your secret is safe with me. But that's what I mean. I wonder if there's some way of checking. Someone should do some research on this. What job has the highest percentage of people who are living their childhood dream, work-wise? Anyway, I digress slightly. We're talking about the state of the trains. Catherine's in Headingley. Catherine, what would you like to say?
Hiya. Sorry if I'm a bit nervous. I'm a bit like...
it's only
can't
me.
Believe this.
It's only me, Catherine.
I graduated last year and then I started getting a job from Headingley. So by car, I only live about 30, 40 minutes away.
Right.
But every morning and every night coming home, it's kind of a struggle to see if I will get home on time. So it's on average, it's taking me about an hour and a half to get home. And that's on a good day. There has been instances where, like, it's been maybe I've not got into the house until maybe 7:45, and I finish about 4:30 work-wise. So you can't. So you don't drive. You rely on the train, but at some point, you might switch. I'm currently getting driving lessons.
There it is. You see,
because I'm not great. I only graduated onto big roads last week. Yeah, I'm terrible.
No, well, don't. Just confidence is a lot of it, but there's nothing worse than an overconfident driver. So just it gets better. I mean, I don't know why you're listening to me. I'm absolutely rubbish, but it does get. But the point is, you don't particularly want to drive to work and back. No. A train is a much more pleasant way of doing it, but you can no longer rely on the service. You can't take it for granted that you'll be there with a bit of wiggle room either way at the time that you're supposed to be there, or that you'll be home at the time that you need to be home.
Yeah, 100%. It's thrown everything kind of out of the window. So it's like, if I have friends that come up, I can't go for drinks in an evening because I'm tired, because I've only just got in. I'm late for work more than I'm on time. There has been like weeks where I've got into work at like 10 o'clock and I start at 9.
And there's nothing you can do about it. See, when I was your age, I was working in a clothes shop in Worcester, and if I was late because of the train, the manager was such a little tyrant, I had to get a letter off the station master. But I mentioned that only, or a note off the station master to confirm that the train had been late. I mentioned that only because it happened so rarely, he thought he could bust me for BSing by making sure, when I said, "Oh, I'm sorry I'm late, the train was late," it was such a rare occurrence that he thought I was lying, and he made me prove that. Whereas for you, it would be even more newsworthy if you turned up on time one day.
Yeah, it's quite an extraordinary experience.
I love that. Where are you working? Because you live in Headingley, do you? Or you work in Headingley? What's the journey you do? What's the journey?
So I'm from Pontefract.
Wow.
That's just like a little bit on Wakefield.
I know
and so
Pontefract.
It's about... Oh, that's cool. No, that's rare.
Well, I went to school with a lad from Pontefract.
Really?
Do you know what his
really
nickname? I think his granddad was a lord actually, but his do you know what his nickname was?
No.
Ponty.
Really? Yeah. Good old Ponty Carlo.
We called him Ponty. I wonder what happened to him. So I know that journey well. I know that part of the world quite well. I went to school in Yorkshire myself, and you can't. I mean, it's a perfect example. It's a hop, a skip, and a jump. Headingly to Ponty, and you can't do it by train. You're going to stop doing it by train. And the idea that we're trying to cut down on carbon emissions, that's someone in their first job, presuming that the train would be the best way to get there and back, discovering the reality is that it no longer is. 25 minutes after 12. Leo's in Carshalton. Leo, what's going on?
James, thank you so much for bringing this up.
We're bringing what?
This particular topic.
State of the trains.
A big fan. I never forget the day I saw the Flying Scotsman come into Victoria.
I was walking up the canal in Brentford a few months ago, and a bloody great steam train just went over the normal railway bridge there. That was, utterly I didn't even know. And it goes through Chiswick as well sometimes, the Flying Scotsman. It's a beautiful thing to see, but we digress.
Well, exactly. However, I am a victim. A very, very upset victim of the Elizabeth line. I moved out to West Drayton, and remember, that's one of the main trains that goes from Paddington out to Heathrow. It is an unmitigated disaster.
Well, but that's because a lot of the trains on the Elizabeth line don't stop at West Drayton.
No, they do. No, it's absolutely fine. The Maidenhead train does, the Reading train. It's not about that. It's about the unreliability and the trauma that you have to go through on a daily basis. That line is known as the worst line in the country.
I stayed at that hotel. Do you know the hotel just over the way from the West Drayton station? It's
not the De Burgh Arms.
No, it's the Fuller's. The Fuller's pub. There's a Fuller's pub just over the way. I stayed there, and when we had builders in, and I know a little bit of what you're talking about. You can't guarantee your journey, can you, in the way that you need to if you work normal hours somewhere?
Well, I could. I lost my job. I mean, basically, and oh yeah. I mean, you literally every single, I'd say 3 or 4 times a week. I mean, I'm on the verge of setting up an action group because.
Yeah, but hang on a minute. The Elizabeth line, it's only been open for 10 minutes. How were you getting to work and back?
4 years.
Is it?
Since 2019, it opened.
Did it really?
I'm telling you, James. If you look at it, I take a catalogue. I've become an Elizabeth line anorak because I literally have to deal with it. I can't get anywhere anymore, and it's constantly there's a problem. It's overhead wires.
But I find
out what's wrong with it by listening to LBC before the people on the platform tell me that work for the company.
I feel your pain. Yeah, well, that's a great advert for LBC, and obviously I feel your pain. But what did you do before it opened? It's not. That's what I mean about it being relatively new. It's not. I don't know. It's quite. You're not. You're in a different.
I didn't live there. I lived in Westbourne Park. I had to deal with the Hammersmith and
City line.
City line.
Yeah,
that was another wind up.
Well, no, it's better than the Elizabeth line.
A lot better. And you'll see, I think you'll probably find many people will tell you how awful it. But what they do is they cancel. They tell you 5 different reasons why the train's not working. And then when you try and get information, and it's not the staff's fault, they don't get informed. And it's really frustrating because they keep saying, oh, the train will be here in 10 minutes, and then they cancel it again. And then you're 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours down the line. You're stuck.
It's not a great advertisement. No, well, I feel your pain, actually. If I didn't before, I do now. Why are you in Carshalton?
So will I tell you the truth?
Yeah. Well, I don't know.
Okay,
You're not in the middle of a crime or anything like that, are you?
No, nothing that exciting.
Hang on, Evie wants to join your action group, mate. You've already got you've got a flipping recruit.
They're more than welcome.
Well, hang on. How did you get to Carshalton then?
So my father had a heart attack.
Oh Lord, I'm sorry.
And my grandmother died.
What?
The next day. She's 102. She just got all her medals awarded to her in August last year.
Well, there's a lot going on in your world at the moment, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. And then I got bitten by an XL bully last Saturday.
Right. None of which explains why you're.
Great time, James.
None of which explains why you're in Carshalton exactly.
Because my dad lives there, and I had to take him out of the hospital and discharge him. So I'm looking after him.
Oh, well done. And did you rely on the railways to get there?
I managed to get there, although, much to my shock, you're not allowed to take a bicycle out of Victoria on the Network Rail, so Southern Railway. You're not allowed to take a bicycle between 7 and 9:30, which is rush hour, and between 4 and 7 in the evening. So basically, any kind of idea about getting rid of pollution, etc., metro, but don't think about cycling.
Well, again, I feel your pain, but equally, if you're on a busy train and someone tries to get on with a bicycle, then it's the closest I ever come to coming out in support for public flogging. So it is. It swings. Yes. It swings and roundabouts. Is your dad okay? More importantly,
but. James, think about it.
No, you think about it. I just asked whether your dad was okay. Is he okay?
He's fine. You know what? He's absolutely much better.
Well, don't let him listen to this.
Bad experience.
Don't let him listen to this show if his heart's a bit dodgy at the moment. It's the last thing he needs is that level of excitement.
Especially with me jumping up and down.
And also completely misrepresenting when the Elizabeth line opened. I knew that was right. Opened on the 24th of May, 2022.
Well, they've got that wrong then, because that's
what do you mean they've got that wrong then? That's the date that the Elizabeth line opened. It was opened by the Queen Elizabeth. So I don't know what your pressure group's going to do, but you need to get your ducks in a slightly more convincing row before it launches. Whew. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. 12:34 is the time. More railway-related mayhem coming up shortly, but before that, rather more important matters. That news report there that we've been hearing all morning. I don't know whether you noticed Amelia eliding perfectly between the EU and the US in her bulletin just then. The UK will join the EU and the US, so absolutely no danger of more complaints that people just had a little moment of thinking the newsreader on LBC was announcing that the UK is set to join the EU. Full stop. Which is what Thomas was accused of earlier by some of you. So, but the story, of course, that they are both reporting on is the news that, well, it's two stories in a way. President Biden has ordered the US military to begin an emergency mission to build a port on the coast of Gaza to accelerate the supply of humanitarian aid. And then the corridor that would serve that port is something upon which the UK and the EU and the USA and some others will cooperate. Noga Tarnopolsky is a freelance journalist in Jerusalem who's helped us out and indeed helped LBC out many times on issues in that region, and she will no doubt do so again today. This is a very big deal, Noga, but it is also quite confusing. I suppose we should start with the question of why it has to be built at all.
Right, James. It is confusing. And it's also very weird, I have to say. One of the reasons it's hard to understand is that we all have a bit of cognitive dissonance. The United States and Israel are close allies, so it is bizarre that they would have had to resort to the air and the sea in order to transfer aid to Gaza, urgently needed humanitarian aid. But the fact is that while Israel remains an ally of the United States, it appears very clear that President Biden has begun to understand what many Israelis are now understanding, and it's that Prime Minister Netanyahu himself isn't that much of an ally. And so instead of engaging in any antagonistic behavior, what the US and following the US now, Europe and the UK are doing is sort of ignoring him. And so we find ourselves in this bizarre situation. Last week, after that terrible incident in which dozens, at least, of Palestinians were killed in a stampede and shot at, aiming at, aid trucks, the United States unilaterally announced that it would start engaging in airdrops of food, which they did in collaboration with the Jordanian Air Force, as if we're talking about Mogadishu and not an area under the control of a close allied nation. And Israel just had to take it. And what we're seeing now is similar but much more forceful. The United States is going to spend several weeks building an offshore seaport. This is a very significant investment through which it expects to bring masses of aid. Gazans are desperate for aid. There are more than 2 million people there, and the need is huge. And simultaneously, but separately, the EU is starting a different sort of aid transfer using Cyprus as a port. The waters off of Gaza are not deep enough to bring major ships.
Okay. I suppose the first point to observe before we examine some of the equally confusing elements of this story is that it suggests nobody is expecting any sort of ceasefire anytime soon.
That may be, but I have to say it appears right now that that's the case. That's true. But even if a ceasefire were to begin tomorrow, the need of the Gazans is huge. And I think that these the US and now Europe are looking for ways to get massive amounts of aid into Gaza. On the one hand, taking responsibility themselves so that it's safe and the Israelis aren't concerned that maybe arms or, cement are getting in.
Yes.
So that's one thing. And on the other hand, that they don't have to deal with the paralysis of the Israeli government because they're doing it on their own.
Why has the flow of aid been so slow? Why has it proved so difficult to get the necessary aid into Gaza?
Because Prime Minister Netanyahu is a deeply unpopular prime minister operating a dysfunctional government with extremist ministers who oppose the very idea of bringing any aid into Gaza. These are people who, after October 7th, their basic response was shut Gaza off to the world. No water, no electricity, no nothing. And this is collective punishment, which is a war crime. And this also is not something that conforms to the Israeli official war aim, which is to destroy Hamas. This destroys the civilian population. But you have a prime minister who's incapable of standing up to these extremist ministers and who may be fairly extremist himself. So he tells the United States, of course we're allowing aid in, and they set up some sort of a system. But at the same time, with not even a wink, he allows Israeli protesters, ultra-right-wingers, to go down to the border crossings and stop the aid trucks. So he's playing a double game. And to me, it looks very clearly like the United States has had it.
Yes. That's the sort of, never mind the humanitarian impact. The diplomatic reading is that the United States have decided they now operate autonomously in the context of ensuring the passage of aid into Gaza. Do you know what you just said about the government and about if you like, the competing interests in that cabinet? Perhaps makes sense of one element of the story that even by the confusing standards you've already referred to, I couldn't quite believe what I was reading. This is in the Daily Telegraph in London today. It says an Israeli official yesterday said the country welcomes the plan to deliver humanitarian aid by sea and will coordinate development of the project with the United States. And just wait for this bit, Noga. Israel, quotes, fully supports, end quotes, creation of such a facility, the official said on condition of anonymity.
Right.
So what's going on there?
I'm trying to think of what other words I could use to describe it, but what you read is exactly the point. Is the Israeli government currently is not a functional government. So it has to resort to accepting these unilateral American statements about what's going on in territory that it ostensibly controls, and it has to accept whatever the United States has decided to do in terms of humanitarian aid, as if the government didn't exist. And then the officials, including the highest officials of this government, are operating on the basis of leaks because they're scared and they have no idea what the actual policy is. And the prime minister is himself volatile. And they don't want to get mucked up in this general administrative chaos that has overtaken Israel.
None of which is particularly good news for the families of the hostages that are still being held in Gaza, of course.
It's catastrophic news for them, and you're right to mention it. And I have to tell you that the kind of anarchy reigning in Israel right now has really hit these families very, very hard. Last night, I saw something I never in my life could have imagined I'd see, which is an Israel police officer punching the mother of a hostage held by Hamas, a woman who looks to be in her late 40s, early 50s, punching her so hard that she fell to the ground and he had to clutch his fist in agony. And
grief.
Yes, it's out of control, but we have to remember that the police is under the very hard hand right now of a minister who, until he became a minister, was considered a terrorist. He's someone convicted of crimes of terror in the state of Israel. He's one of these fringy, loony allies of the prime minister who needed him because he's on trial. And we're all, in Israel, there's a real feeling of descending into, some sort of administrative, political police abyss right now.
That's terrifying. I mean, for all sorts of reasons, only some of which we've alluded to. But we're short of time, so I'll close with a question about the significance of Benny Gantz's meeting with Kamala Harris on Monday, and his expression subsequently. He was surprised how angry the US was over the impasse in Gaza. I mean, it speaks to what Biden announced in his State of the Union address, but it also speaks to domestic Israeli politics, that Gantz is on this sort of diplomatic tour of world leaders, including this country, even though he is opposed to Benjamin Netanyahu at home.
That's right. And it's important to mention that in the UK, he actually had a half-hour meeting with the Prime Minister, with Rishi Sunak.
Which infuriated Netanyahu, I read.
Yes. I think most allied leaders right now are excoriating Netanyahu. And the only thing I would want to mention, in addition to that, is that Netanyahu has maybe 20% approval among Israelis.
Good Lord.
So these foreign leaders are taking a bet that Israelis understand and share their views. In terms of the trip itself, you're absolutely right. It's an abnormal situation. Benny Gantz, who's a war cabinet member, should have known ahead of this trip how angry foreign governments are. The fact that he didn't have access to that information ahead of time is remarkable. And then the fact that he decided, for whatever reason, to unilaterally go on this trip also shows you that the Israeli government right now is hard. It's hard for me to find the words to describe how little it's functioning as a real government of a sovereign state.
You've used the word anarchy in a broader context. I suspect it's probably pretty close to the bone on the specifics of government as well now.
Yeah.
Noga, thank you. Noga Tarnopolsky. In some ways, I hope you'll allow me to say this, in some ways your tone speaks almost as loudly as your words today. The sense of frustration and confusion that I pick up from you as a close watcher of these events is remarkable.
Well, I'm being dead honest with you because I think it's important to transmit this reality, however grim and however confusing it really is.
And we are very, very grateful for that. We really are. Thank you. Because, of course, much of what you tell us, much of what Noga reports from the ground in Jerusalem is still slightly at odds with certainly what some corners of the British media are reflecting, not least the provenance of that policing minister, which we've talked about a little bit on this programme, but which, in the context of some of the coverage and some of the noises coming out of Conservative politicians, is truly remarkable. Noga Tarnopolsky, they're doing us all very proud. 12:46 is the time. It is 10 minutes to 1, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you follow me on Twitter, Noga has posted the footage of the incident she just referred to, where an Israeli police officer punched the mother of one of the hostages still being held in Gaza so hard that he subsequently holds his own fist in agony. It is a truly breathtaking piece of film that I will share with you shortly. But it also remains remarkable, to me at least, as someone who has tried and I think succeeded in keeping a very even keel in coverage of these issues. Remember, I'm not a great fan of the argument that the BBC can't be biased because the number of people accusing it of being right-wing is roughly the same as the number of people accusing it of being left-wing. But if I have a roughly equal number of comments in my inbox accusing me of being a shill who is doing the bidding of my Jewish paymasters and accusing me of being a Hamas supporter or a Jew hater, then I'm fairly confident that we're getting everything exactly right. But the failure of the British media and possibly even the, quotes, independent, end quotes, counter-terrorism advisor to the Home Office, who's quoted widely in the media today to have a look at or to display some knowledge of the background of the politician that Noga referred to, Itamar Ben-Gvir, is truly extraordinary. Particularly discussing the impact of phrases like "from the river to the sea" on banners or even on the lips of people protesting for peace in Palestine, and the potentially genocidal ramifications of that phrase that many believe and many claim. You have a look at what Itamar Ben-Gvir stands for, currently the minister for the security minister, the head of the police ultimately in Israel, and you understand why many people fear that the coverage we get in many corners of the UK media is not really fair or balanced at all. 12:51 is the time. I think I'll take a quick clip of Full Disclosure, actually, and then go back to the railway calls, because it kind of ties in with what I've just said. This is a rare interview on Full Disclosure with a Conservative politician. Actually, they're not that rare. We've had a few Conservative politicians on, but I wonder if you can guess what they've all got in common. Rory Stewart has been on Full Disclosure. Well, no, actually, I think he was on the one I did before we launched No, he was on Full Disclosure. Longest pause you'll ever hear on a podcast when Rory Stewart came on Full Disclosure. In response, I think, to the question of whether or not he believed Boris Johnson to be dangerous. This is before Boris Johnson. Or shortly after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. Dominic Grieve has been on recently. Who are there? What other Tories? Have we had other Tories on there? Ken Clarke has been on Full Disclosure. Can you guess what they've all got in common? Michael Heseltine, I think, has been on Full Disclosure. I've certainly interviewed him a few times. And now Sayeeda Warsi, former chair of the Baroness Warsi to you. And one of the most enjoyable conversations with a politician that I've had in a very long time. And I generally enjoy all of them. But she had quite a lot to say. She's got her own podcast now out, which she does with David Baddiel, called A Muslim and a Jew Go There. So it speaks to some of the stuff we've just touched upon in the context of what's happening in Israel at the moment. But here is a little taster of this week's Full Disclosure with Sayeeda Warsi.
So Mum and Dad had always had different politics. Mum had always voted Conservative. Dad had always voted Labour. So there was always a discussion in the house. And I think as I got older, I realised that for all the challenges that there were with the Conservative Party, and, Enoch Powell still casts a dark shadow over most kind of Asian or black thinking on the Conservative Party, that ultimately, if I thought about the way I wanted to live my life, the kind of way in which I thought, then my ideology was more centre-right than it was centre-left. Do I agree? Did I agree with everything the Conservative Party thought about at that point? No. Do I agree with everything they think about now? No. But why? People think that they should agree with everything their party puts out. You could be married to somebody for 30, 40 years and still disagree with them on all sorts of things. This is not, you're not married to this party.
It's funny you say that. Because a caller said to me the other day talking about Starmer in a different context, using the marriage analogy in a slightly different way. They said you don't have to marry him. You just have to recognise that he's driving the bus going in the direction that you want to go. There's going to be a million different people on that bus, but it is about a broad sense of affinity rather than a football fan style loyalty to a party. My country, right or wrong, they do wrong. My party does make mistakes. You mentioned Enoch Powell. Ted Heath threw him out.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. There was a time when mainstream Conservative politics would not allow extremists to hang around.
Well, you're preempting my next question, which is, do you think Rishi Sunak would have done?
Oh, I think Rishi is no Ted Heath, right? And in many ways, you kind of look back and think it should be easier for Rishi. I mean, one of the things that when Rishi became Prime Minister, I thought this is hugely historic. The first Prime Minister of colour this country has ever had. And whatever you think of his politics, right or left, you've got to celebrate that moment. I think what breaks my heart now is that tragically his tenure will be remembered as probably one of the most racist. And does he want to be the Prime Minister who presided over a party that was worse than it was during the kind of views that Enoch Powell had? And he should clamp down on this. If for no other reason, if he looks back and thinks, well, I'm not going to be in office in 5 months' time, then, throw everything else out now. Exactly. Other than just focus on your principles now. Make sure that stop trying to be what the right want you to be. Just be the decent centre ground Conservative that I know he's capable of being.
12:55 is the time. She didn't really answer the question, did she? If you're looking for a headline there, did Sayeeda Warsi say that Rishi Sunak wouldn't have thrown Enoch Powell out of the party? I'm not sure. I'll tell you what else is very interesting. Who do you think she blames for radicalising David Cameron? Remember, she was a senior member of David Cameron's cabinet. First Muslim woman, of course, to sit in a cabinet. Which politician do you think she blames for radicalising David Cameron? That comes up in that Full Disclosure interview as well. I may have time for two, but certainly one more call on railways. Graham is in Totnes. Professional or passenger, Graham, and what's going on?
Very much a passenger, but before I explain, James, I just want to say what a treat it is to hear your application of emotional intelligence. The way that you interview people, including on the Gaza issue just now, is just extraordinary to hear. It's brilliant.
Oh, lovely thing to say. Thank you.
Well, I've thought that on more than one occasion when I've listened, and it's great to have a chance to explain it. But the last time we spoke, I referred to the privatisation of profit and the nationalisation of loss.
It's a brilliant line. It's very true as well, isn't it? More so than ever.
Well, I think the trains explain it beautifully. The real problem I've got, being of a certain age now, I like to know, and living in the southwest, if I travel, it's likely to be a distance to the Midlands or to London. I want to know I've got a seat.
Yes.
Now, the big issue is the train companies are allowed to cancel a train up to 10 o'clock the day before, 10 o'clock at night, that is, the day before that you're travelling, and they suffer no penalty whatsoever as a result of doing that. So I can shell out a significant sum of money very happily, because I love travelling by train, with the promise that I'll have a reserved seat, only to find that the night before the train gets cancelled and I've got the train that I was to have a seat on is no longer running.
So the one you get on has no reservation, so you don't have a guarantee of a seat in the train that you finally get on.
Yeah, we had that. We travelled up to London the weekend of the before the Queen's funeral.
Oh yes.
And we we went up by coach because there were no train seats, but we managed to book a train on the way back. And just before 10 o'clock, the day before we were due to come back, the train was cancelled. Now, if you can imagine on a bank holiday type weekend in that sort of situation,
and are you not entitled to a full refund in those circumstances? But of course you don't want a full refund. You want to get to London.
Indeed, I want to know that I can sit. Now, just one last thing on this.
I haven't really got time. I'll tell you what, Graham. Let's leave them wanting more. Yeah.
You're a gentleman.
No, you're a gentleman as well. That was a very kind thing that you said at the beginning of your call as well, not least because it meant that you didn't have time to finish the reasons that you'd actually rung in to talk about. So I don't know. Make of that what you will. Graham, God bless, mate. Take care. That's it from me for another day and indeed for another week. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. Thanks. 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 Time for Sheila Fogarty.